Tonight is, I think this is a bit of important history that African Americans take for granted, uh, or they don't know, and they need to know, because there are there are a lot of misconceptions about the American Revolution where it concerns African Americans. Now we know in 1776, the African Americans, for the most part, were in slavery. They were enslaved, and the war did not end slavery for African Americans. However, the American Revolution was the most important event in the history of this country. Without it, there will be no United States of America. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 was an important event not only for white colonists, but Black people, enslaved or not. And tonight we're going to discuss why the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War was important for Black people. Now, contrary to popular belief, the American 13 colonies were British. No, you hear a lot about 1619. You hear that in 1619, the first slaves came to America. Well, actually, in 1619, the first Black people came to America. They were not slaves, they were indentured servants, and they was brought here by the Portuguese on a Dutch ship. However, eventually they did become slaves, but they were not slaves when they came. But the British were in control of the 13 colonies. And the people of those colonies were British citizens and subjects of the British king, King George. Contrary to popular belief, before 1776, slavery in the colonies were under British control. You hear it said by many African Americans today that July 4th has no meaning to them, but freedom from the British was important to everyone who lived in the colonies, even African Americans. Whether you agree, disagree, or don't want to celebrate it, it was a very important step in this country. We just have to face that fact. You know the story of why the people rebelled against the British. I mean, you learn all of that in school. You learn all about the Tea Party and all of that. So we won't go down that trail. But I will tell you why it was important to thousands of Black people. I'll tell you about one Black person first. I'm going to single him out. I might single out a couple of Black people, but I'm going to single out this one particular Black man. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, excuse me, that's 6 years before the Declaration of Independence. March 5th, 1770, British troops fired into a crowd of angry American colonists in Boston. These colonists had taunted and violently harassed the British soldiers. 5 colonists, including a Black man named Crispus Attucks, were killed. I'm
Not too long ago.
okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I don't know what's going on here. The event, which became known as the Boston Massacre, helped fuel the outrage against the British rule. And that was the early stages of the American Revolution. Accounts suggest that Christopher Attucks, a Black middle-aged sailor and rope maker, was the very first person killed by the British in the American Revolutionary War. Attucks has been celebrated not just as one of the first martyrs in what became the fight for American independence, but also as a symbol of African American struggle and freedom and equality. The fight for independence didn't start in 1776. Like I said, it started 6 years earlier. But he was the first Black person, or the first colonist to die standing up for freedom from the British. Now, I don't know if many people know this, but Black men played a big role in this 10-year war. See, the revolution lasted 10 years. 1776 was just a year that the so-called founding fathers wrote a letter declaring their independence from England. That wasn't the beginning and that wasn't the end of the war. We celebrate that because that's the day they wrote the letter and informed the British that they were no longer going to pay attention to the king's rule. They were no longer going to be under his control. They were going to control themselves. Black men played a big role. Many enslaved men fought in the war on both sides because they were promised freedom. There were free Black men who fought with George Washington's Continental Army because they too wished independence from the British king. Now, to be more specific, during the American Revolutionary War, African American men, both enslaved and free, fought in the Continental Army. Black soldiers served in mostly integrated units at this time. See, at that time, they didn't do a lot of this segregated stuff. There was only one army, the Continental Army, and the militias that George Washington had formed to fight the British. However, they did have one unit that was filled with Black men and Native Americans. They were called the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and they were the most famous regiment of the Revolutionary War that included African Americans. Now, let's see if we can get some numbers here. You may ask, you may be wondering, well, how many Black men actually fought in the Revolutionary War? Well, I'm going to give you an answer to that question. 8,000 Black men served with George Washington's Continental Army fighting the British. But I think I would be remiss if I don't tell you this. 20,000 African Americans served with the British fighting the Americans, because the British had given a decree that every runaway slave, a free Black man that would join the British Army to fight the rebels who were the American colonists, they would be given freedom. So in essence, 28,000 Black men actually fought in the Revolutionary War. Now, let's see if I can give you some other numbers. It was about 400,000 actual American men, Black and white, who fought in that war. America didn't have very many people in it at that time. It wasn't like, well, I may be getting a little ahead of myself. Maybe I shouldn't say it was 400,000 who fought, because I'm counting women and children. It wasn't very many people in America at that time. So I'd say maybe 200,000 over a 10-year period. Now just notice what I'm saying. Over a 10-year period, about 200,000 men fought in that war. But there was never a period where 200,000 fought at the same time. You understand what I'm trying to get out?
Here.
The boss lady brought me some water.
Thank you, Regina. So, Regina, thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Somebody was looking out for me. Thank you. Anyway, now, both sides, the American side and the British side, promised black men freedom if they fought in the war. Now, you had to win the war now. You know, you had to win the war to get these guys freedom. But all of the men who fought in the war, black, were not slaves. See, we were under the impression that everybody was slaves during 1776, 1780. No. There were 30,000 free black people who lived in the 13 colonies. 30,000 free black people who lived in 13 colonies. They represented about 5% of the total African American population. At that time, it was only about 2 million people living in the Americas, and 400,000 of those 2 million were African American. So 30,000 of that 400,000 were free people. And the men of those free people, they wanted freedom from the British as well. Because if you think about it, these men were businessmen, these men was farmers, you know, they worked just like the white men to earn their living. They paid taxes to the British just like the white men. They didn't like to be taxed without representation either. So therefore, these men wanted England out of the Americas just like the white men. They had wives and kids, and some of them even had slaves. So it wasn't just a total 100% just white people wanted the British out of America. Now, what happened during this war? Black men fought, black men died to get freedom from the British. There was another black man named Peter Salem. He's known for his crucial contribution to the onset of the Revolution. He was born in slavery in Massachusetts in the mid-18th century. He joined the Patriots in the earliest battles of the war, participating as a Minuteman at Lexington and Concord. Those are famous battles. There were several black men who fought in those so-called famous battles that you have to look in the history book to know what they were, because not many of us really remember those battles because they didn't really get into detail in school telling us what battle they was fighting in. But I tell you what, these black men who fought helped George Washington and the Minutemen and the Continental Army defeat the British. And without their help, there would not have been an America. If British had won, they would have had America, and they would have had black people in slavery a lot longer than 1865. So My only point in pushing that and saying that is that you have black patriots just like white patriots. They don't make the movies about the black patriots. They make the movies about the white patriots. You know, they make the movies about John Paul Jones and If Only Had One Life to Live, and you know the guys that made all the famous statements of the Revolutionary War. But independence was on their mind. Even the slaves, and I'm going to say this, and some of you may disagree with me, but even the slaves benefited from the Revolutionary War. And you know why I can say that? Because the positive changes that took place at the end of that war. Now I can tell you, the war actually ended in 1781. 1781. We celebrate 1776 because that's the day they wrote the Declaration of Independence. But in 1881, it's when the British finally surrendered. Okay? They surrendered, making America a legitimate United States of America. The positive changes for the slave population in 1776, although they was limited, and it wasn't like all slaves was going to run around and be free, it did create new ideas. The abolition movement was born. They was inspired by liberty during the Revolutionary War. Anti-slavery movements was born. The North had led the push for emancipation laws. Before there were no emancipation laws. Manumission became a big deal. They started issuing, they increased the manumissions. And if you don't know what manumission means, that was slaves being freed by their masters and given papers and documents stating that they were free. The Upper South and the North started freeing their slaves after the Revolutionary War. Now, another thing that happened during the war, thousands of enslaved people escaped slavery and ran to the North. Because during the war, nobody had time to be trying to chase after no slaves when you're fighting the British. The British is trying to kill you. And we had a battle right here in St. Louis during the Revolutionary War. So slaves could run away and go north, go to Canada, go to New York, go to Connecticut, go to Rhode Island, and no one was trying to catch them because it was like the war is going on. So that abolition movement grew by leaps and bounds. Religious participation and political inspiration got involved. Even the religious groups. At one time, religious groups was just silent. They was like, you know what? Hey, that's just the way it is. They was pushing slavery just as hard as everybody else. But during after the Revolutionary War, or during it and after, some of the religious groups, some of the Christian groups started to reassess their thinking. And they started thinking, well, we have written this document talking about all men are created equal. So maybe we need to think about letting these people have their freedom. It was called a Second Great Awakening when the religious groups began to push to let Black folks be free. They was pushing against the so-called leaders of the new United States of America. The northern states began to dismantle slavery through legislation following the war. It was a gradual process in most states. But remember, the British were in control of the 13 colonies. The British were the ones who made all the slavery rules and regulations. But then after the war, some of those same states that was filled with slaves, they began to say, you know what, we need to get rid of slavery. We don't need these slaves. I tell you something that happened. The northern states like like Vermont, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, they came up with slavery bans in their constitution. When they became a state, they banned slavery in their state because before there were slaves in all 13 colonies. Every state from New York to Georgia, because Florida was not part of the Americas at the time, there were slaves. Okay, so don't let anybody tell you, well, I'm from Massachusetts, I'm from New York. They had slaves in all those states until those states decided, like Vermont in 1777, they decided to write a constitution and get rid of slaves. Pennsylvania, 1780, they passed the first gradual emancipation law in the United States. It stipulated that all children born to an enslaved mother after the act was passed would be free upon reaching the age of 28. See, they put all these limits, they put all these qualifications, but they was gradually getting rid of slavery. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, they just flat out wrote in their constitution, it's illegal to have slaves in Massachusetts, period. Now, I have to tell you guys this. A lot of these people who actually owned slaves in those states, they didn't just free their slaves. A lot of them sold their slaves to the South. Okay? They made slavery illegal in those states. Some of the people did go free, but a lot of those guys who was hardcore slave owners sold their slaves to the southern states. Like Virginia. Virginia had a law. They finally started manumission and allowing slaves to be free. But all those laws got reversed in Virginia by the 1860s or the 1850s. And people who was black people who were still there, who didn't have manumission papers, could be enslaved again. You know, the chaos of the Revolutionary War provided many enslaved people with the opportunity to escape. British forces were so happy to get black men to come fight for the Brits. They told them that if we win the war, you would be free. Well, we all know the British didn't win the war, right? So the British had to leave the shores of America. It wasn't like George Washington and his army put up a big POW camp and kept all those British people, soldiers. They had to leave the American shores. That was the way that worked. We defeated you. Now get on your ship and go back to England. Well, when black men tried to get on, the black men and their families tried to get on those ships, some was turned away. Some did get back on the ship, get on the ship, but instead of them taking them to England, they took them to Newfoundland. Okay, Newfoundland. And the white Newfoundlanders, or whatever you call them, they wasn't that happy about all these free black people coming there. So they had their own little racist ideas and things that went on. But they did give some of them freedom, but all they left one hell and went to another hell. And think about this one. The black men who went to fight for the British after the British lost, that didn't get on the ships and didn't leave, guess what the American colonists did to them? You went right back to slavery because they looked at you as a traitor because you went and fought with the enemy. Instead of joining us, you joined them. So now you're in trouble. But now, even though now George Washington, he did do what he said he was going to do. The 8,000 black men that fought for with George Washington, the vast majority of them who were slaves, who were not free, got their freedom. However, some of their enslavers who had convinced them to go fight in the war in their stead tried to make them slaves again. But they couldn't make them slaves again because, that was one of them well-known promises that even the new president was like, well, no, you can't make them slaves now. You promised them freedom, give them that manumission. So eventually they got their freedom. Mhm. Now, don't get me wrong. Just because they fought in the Revolutionary War, and just because some of the enslaved ones became free, and just because there was 30,000 already free black men, that did not mean that these people did not suffer and face persistent discrimination in everything. Okay? They got discriminated. They was free. They was free. But they had discrimination in housing, discrimination in job, discriminations in everything. They couldn't sit on juries. They could never, in short, they was free, but they was still limited in what they could do. I mean, they didn't have to worry about the whip. They didn't have to worry about nobody making them do anything, but they still were discriminated against. They had to create their own way of life. They couldn't not gonna go work for the white man at the barrel factory or the shipyard and get equal pay unless some black man had a shipyard or a barrel factory. And some of the black men did, like that Peter Salem, he did have or Paul, I'm sorry, there was a guy named Paul Cuffey who was a sail maker for the ships in Boston. He hired a bunch of free black men to work in his sail making company. But he did that just so he could help these black men have a living. Now, this brings me to my last section here. We have many African Americans who today, 160 years later, who never seen slavery, never been in slavery, only know about slavery from what they read in books or what they see in movies, who think the 4th of July is only for white people. They think it's not for black people. And they have been sold a bill of goods. They are living in a false fantasy. Although the 4th of July is a celebration of the independence of the 13 colonies from the British, like I said before, there was 30,000 free black people who also celebrated their independence from the British. There were another 8,000 or 9 or however many that survived that war who celebrated their independence. But now I understand that there's a complex uh, and painful reminder of 1776 being independence for Europe, I mean for white European people from the British, and black people, 90% of black people were still in slavery. I understand that. I'm not crazy. I understand that. But would you believe that even though there were African Americans who were slaves after 1776, they celebrated and commemorated the 4th of July. They used the holiday as an opportunity to assert their own claims to liberty, citizenship, and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. These collaborations sometimes took place not on the 4th, but on the 5th of July or other days to avoid violent repercussions from white mobs. Because white mobs, when they saw black slaves celebrating, let's be honest, you know what happened. But that didn't stop these black people from celebrating. They involved organizing their own gatherings. They had parades, they had recitals to express their aspirations for emancipation and equality. What they would do, they would celebrate it and push for the powers that were in charge to stop being hypocrites, speaking about some equality and freedom while we're still slaves. But they would celebrate. The 4th of July was a potent symbol of the nation's founding ideas of freedom and equality, which they were denied. So even though they used the holiday to demonstrate their patriotism and citizenship and to argue on their own emancipation, see, they used it as a political statement to say, look at us, we're celebrating, we want to be free just like you. But in short, they still celebrated. Mutual societies, black communities organized events, parades, recitals, late night dancing, celebrated traditions in their own right. And some people make a mistake of thinking that Frederick Douglass didn't celebrate the 4th of July because he gave that speech on the 5th of July, where he made the statement that the 4th of July was a white man's celebration and all of that good stuff. But the part they always leave out. I remember one year I recited that speech in the old courthouse downtown on the 4th of July. I was dressed up in a Civil War uniform and we had a program. I used to belong to this African American Genealogical Society. I was the president actually. And we put a program on down there, and it was the rotunda of the old courthouse was filled with white people. And I gave that speech. Matter of fact, a couple of white guys got upset about it. And the park rangers had to take them out of the room. But still, it's a part of that speech that people of Frederick Douglass, they don't understand. Frederick Douglass made the statement that when every black man, woman, and child was free from slavery, he would celebrate the 4th of July. In 1865, every black man, woman, and child was free from slavery. And after that event, for the rest of his life, Frederick Douglass celebrated the 4th of July. Because we must realize one thing. This is not in my history research. This is just me talking. We must realize one thing. We are Americans. We fought, we bled, we died, we labored, we worked hard for this citizenship. Do not let anyone, black or otherwise, convince you that this is not your country. This is our country. We know no other country. Yes, our ancestors came from Africa. But you know how long ago that was? that our ancestors came from Africa. We are Americans. This is our country. If we all went to Africa, all 60 million of us, where would they put us? Those Africans would try to wipe us out because they would not want all of us intelligent, educated black people coming over there because if we went, we're going to take over. We're going to run the government, and they're not going to have that. So this is our country. We're here to make it better for us. We've been fighting for 160 years to make America better for us. I mean, from the end of slavery until today, we have been fighting to make America better for us. And now we cannot allow anyone, I disagree with anyone who say that we're not Americans and we shouldn't be proud of America's traditions, because we should. We have participated in everything that America has gone through, from the Revolutionary War until this very day. So we are not going to allow any of these naysayers to tell us that we are not Americans. That's not going to happen. I wore the nation's uniform myself. That right there is my discharge from the United States Marines. I am patriotic to this country. No, I don't love whoever they put in the White House. I don't love all those people, but it's my country. If I don't like him, I vote him out. I'm not going to say this is not my country, because it is. Other than that, guys, let me get off the soapbox and see if you guys have any questions.
Brother Robinson, I don't have any questions, but I will say thank you so much, because I learned so much today that I did not know. So thank you for the information that you shared with us.
And you are very welcome. I tell you guys, we need to, I don't see them. I wish more men would get interested and pay attention to these sessions, because they are the most ignorant ones about our history. And I can say that because I talk to them all the time. Okay? They are the most ignorant ones about our history, but yet they will stand and argue with you until they about to pass out, get angry, and everything is the white man's fault. So it's like, maybe if some of them would start listening, they will find out that it's not as they think. It's different. We've done a lot more than they think we've done as a people. As a people. They don't realize that as a people, we are the most educated black people on the face of this earth. We are. Not the people in Africa, not the people in Brazil, not the Caribbean. We are. So they need to realize that. We have made a lot of strides. I mean, to come from slavery just 160 years ago to where we are today, that's a miracle. You know how long it took the children of Israel to be something? It took from the time they left Egypt until 1947. You know, that's a long time. Okay? It didn't take us that long. But I'm on the soapbox again. Any other questions?
I want to tell you thank you for teaching this. I'm so glad I got to learn this, because I didn't get to learn about this in school. And now when it's the 4th of July, I'm gonna think differently about the 4th of July.
You asking a question because I heard you, but I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry. I know. I'm just gonna say that now on the 4th of July, I'm gonna think differently because it's about the about the about you about the black people too because let's be fair, but
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
because it's fair.
Well, that's good because, yeah, the 4th of July is, I know, I understand the complicated thoughts that some black people have because they think of the time that when they won, when the war was over with, the Revolutionary War was over with, and they're thinking about, were they going to just go and free all the black people because they don't quite understand that the Revolutionary War was not fought to free black people from slavery. They are confusing that with the Civil War.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The Revolutionary War was fought to make Europe, the king of England, stop taking money and goods from the colonists. That's what they was fighting for. They wasn't really fighting to free no slaves.
No.
No, they were not. But either way, it did help African Americans
Yes, you
because
did.
think of it this way. What, another 60 years, slavery was over with
Mhm.
after that war.
Mhm.
And slavery was rough, but the British would have kept control as long as they could have, if they could have. Okay? If they could have, they would have, but they
Right.
couldn't. Because we think of a place like India.
Okay.
The British controlled India for 400 years. They didn't get their freedom from the British until Mahatma Gandhi.
Uh-huh.
And that was in the 1930s.
Uh-huh.
So that's when so you have to look at things from a historical point of view. You We finally got free, but these white people always had a plan. They to get free, they come up with Jim Crow.
Mhm.
And then when we get rid of Jim Crow, they come up with something else.
Mhm.
But we're still here, and we fought it. And don't let anyone tell you that 4th of July is not a holiday that we should celebrate because it is.